Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. Samyang has had an interesting few years where they were largely off my radar for a lot of reasons because they were releasing fewer products, and also I had lost contact with the company and didn't really have anyone to set me up with loaners and an opportunity to review their most recent lenses. Fortunately, that has changed here in 2025, and recently I gave you a review of the first collaboration between Schneider and LK Samyang, as they're now called, of the 14 to 24mm f2.8 wide-angle zoom, a lens that I actually really liked. LK Samyang is continuing to produce products on their own, however, outside of that partnership with Schneider. And today I'm looking at the first of a couple of those lenses that are releasing here in 2025 that are coming just from LK Samyang. That does raise a little bit of a confusing point, however, because LK Samyang already released during that time where I was disconnected from the company, they released what was essentially a Series 2 version of their 35mm f1.4. They put it under a new lens designation, or a new series designation called Prima at that point, Prima being Latin for first or premier. And so they released that lens, which seemed to be a new take on their full frame f1.4 type lenses. So this year they're back with a couple of new Prima lenses, including this one, the 16mm f2.8, along with an 85mm f1.8, both of which I'll be using as a part of filming this review here today. These lenses are much more like their Tiny series or their VAF series, though they're not video-centric. And so they are more compact. They obviously have smaller maximum apertures. They really don't have much in common with the 35mm f1.4. So is this the new direction for the Prima series? I guess we're going to find out. This lens is interesting, however, and while some people have written it off because it has an f2.8 rather than an f1.8 maximum aperture, I think this lens is going to make a lot of sense for a lot of people. We'll dive into it in today's review. Now, in full disclosure, this lens was sent to me from LK Samyang for testing. They have had no input in the review itself, nor have they seen it before you are seeing it today. This is a completely independent review, as always. So let's talk build and handling. I'm actually using the 85mm f1.8 Prima lens to film this particular section. So the price comes in at $475 US. Now, I give you that with an asterisk as the final price has not been announced, but that is the ballpark. Right under $500 is where it will come. The lens itself, as you can see, is very nice and compact. And so it does slot in nicely, very slightly larger than the Tiny series, about similar in length to the VAF series, though narrower in diameter. This is a great size of lens, and it means it's going to be a nice pairing for bodies like Sony's A7C series, and obviously on other bodies, it fits in there nice and lightweight. The lens is 69.8 millimeters or 2.75 inches in diameter, and just a hair longer, 70.5 millimeters or 2.77 inches. So really nice and compact. It weighs only 207 grams or 7.3 ounces. So this is a lens that is very easy to bring along if you're backpacking, hiking, things like that, or traveling abroad and you have weight restrictions on your luggage. This is the kind of lens that you're looking for because you can bring it along without too much of a weight penalty. Has a front filter thread of 62 millimeters, which is shared across a number of other lenses. And by the way, the 85mm f1.8 Prima does share that 62 millimeter as well. Now, it's actually made of a new material. The original Tiny series, it did have a plastic exterior, but it was really cheap plastics. It would flex under your fingers. It had kind of a glossy finish that, at this stage maybe looks a little bit dated. They have a whole new engineered plastics that they have developed that frankly feels a lot like the tough, durable plastics that are being used in like the Viltrox Air series. That is not a negative, that's certainly a positive. This is very fingerprint resistant. It does feel tough, and yes, it is a plastic, but this does feel like a lens that probably could survive some bumps and maybe even some falls. And so I appreciate that. They have a different and unique diamond style pattern, knurled finish to the actual focus ring. I like this. It's different from their other lenses, and it's different from lenses generally. And so it kind of reminds me maybe most of like the control ring on Canon RF lenses. It's a look that I like, and I think that it works here. The lens isn't fancy. It's a fairly straightforward lens in terms of its overall appearance, but that does set it apart as being just a little bit different than other opposing lenses. The manual focus ring has nice damping. It's a little bit on the light side. I would like it maybe a hair heavier, but it's very consistent. The focus motor is responsive, so you get a nice manual focus simulation. There's about 135 degrees of focus throw, and it feels fairly linear in operation. I don't know if it's perfectly linear, but it seems that I can do fairly repeatable focus pulls at this point. On the side of the lens, we do have an AF/MF switch, which is always welcome, and that switch operates with good precision, has a definite feel to it. Manufacturing seems good on this lens. They have also taken another cue from Viltrox, and that is that there's now a USB-C port in the lens mount. That's a great step for them because in times past you had to buy a separate dock, the Samyang lens station, to do firmware updates or any kind of customization of lenses. And so the ability to just do a direct USB-C connection is great. And to me, that place on the actual lens mount makes the most sense because then you don't have any kind of issues with weather sealing because it's always in a sealed position up against the body itself. Speaking of weather sealing, the lens not only has a gasket at the rear mount, it has 3 other internal points up near the front, at the ring, and at the switch there on the side. And so while it's not the most complex weather sealing that I've seen before, it seems capable and able to get the job done. And they have tested it up to an IP5 rating, I believe that I read in some of their literature. And so certainly some positives there, at least when it comes to dust intrusion and some moisture resistance as well. It does come with a nicely made lens hood. And again, this is a definite improvement over the Tiny series. The plastics definitely feel more upscale. And what's more, it bayonets on with just a greater precision. It locks in a very definite way. I would say that the manufacturing has taken a step forward for Samyang over the last few years. This is definitely a step in the right direction. Now, as noted, one of the advertised strengths of the lens is its ability to focus very closely and thus give you a high level of magnification. And you certainly can focus very closely as 12 centimeters. Only problem with that is that if I measure from the sensor to the front of the lens hood, it's about 11 centimeters, leaving you just 1 centimeter of working distance, making it very easy to shade your subject. You're probably going to always want to remove the lens hood when you're shooting an up-close subject so you can allow a little bit more light to reach to it. However, if you can achieve that optimal situation, you can get magnification on full frame of 0.33 times. You switch into APS-C, and that will jump up to 0.5 times, or a 1 to 2 macro level. That certainly adds to the versatility of the lens and is just an extra bonus there. The aperture blade here has 7 aperture blades. That will produce a 14-bladed Sunstar if you're in the kind of conditions when you're stopping down to achieve that. Sunstar looks okay. It gets increasingly better as you stop the lens down. And so if that's a priority to you, go F11, F16, even F22, and you will get increasingly more definite Sunstars out of the lens itself. I like the package. I think it's nothing particularly fancy in terms of the look, but it's a nice clean design that does look a little bit more upscale than something like the Viltrox Air series. And it should, with the price point. It also has weather sealing, which the Air series does not, but it still is very compact and lightweight. This is a lens that's going to be easy to bring along. I applaud that design decision. So let's talk autofocus. I'm filming on the lens right now just so you have a sense of the general rendering for a situation like this. LK Samyang has equipped this lens with a linear focus motor, and as you can see from my formal test here, focus is very, very quick, very near instant in making ordinary focus changes, whether that's indoors or outdoors. I've never really noticed any kind of slowdown in any situation that I shot in, but always found autofocus to consistently be very fast, and fortunately it's also very accurate. Now that, because of the close focus abilities of the lens, has to include accurate focus at very close focus distances, and I was able to achieve that as well. And so the combination, for example, this shot shooting up towards Ivy, you can see a little bit of a preview how sharp and how high contrast the lens is. Or in this shot of a wildflower, you can see even at close focus distances just how well focus is nailed. And so I didn't notice any kind of issue with focus for stills at all. The focus speed was good. The focus motor is very quiet. I could feel a little bit of, not really vibration, but just could feel in my hands a little bit when I was doing the formal test, the thrust back and forth. And so maybe it's not perfectly damped, but overall focus performance for stills was really quite fantastic. Video autofocus was also quite good, though with one minor exception that I'll point out here. In terms of doing my focus test where I do pulls back and forth, you can see that that happens very smoothly, it happens quickly, it's well damped, no issues there. But what I did notice is that while focus breathing is low, when I was doing my test for it, I noticed that there's some pretty obvious warping in the corners. Now that could be due to the correction profile that is trying to correct for that, but certainly it is something to watch out for, that if you're doing a major focus change and you do have corrections on for distortion, you may see some of that warping effect. What I did find on the positive note is that if you're not doing a major focus change back and forth, corrections were working well and giving me nice straight lines, whereas the lens does have a significant amount of barrel distortion, as we'll see in a moment. The correction profile is doing a good job of correcting for that. Now, when it comes to my hand test, no issues there. Good transitions from the hand to the eye and back and forth. And then I also found whether I was shooting static shots, I was able to get good stable performance. And then in other situations where I was trying to create natural focus changes, moving from one subject to another, I felt that overall it was good. It maybe wasn't quite as reactive as what I would like in every one of those situations, but it's also well damped. And so there's nothing that's kind of jarring or pulls you out of the shot. In general, this is a lens I think that would work well on a gimbal, would work well for vlogging and things like that. It's got a great focal length and it's got good autofocus for video performance. So let's talk about image quality. The optical design here is 8 elements in 7 groups. So those of you that prefer simpler optical designs, this one's for you. 1 HR, a high refractive index element, 3 extra low dispersion elements, 1 aspherical element in the design. And so if you're counting at that point, that's 5 out of the 8 elements that are exotic elements, leaving only 3 ordinary elements behind. So that helps to achieve a pretty strong performance. The MTF shows a very sharp center, a very sharp mid-frame, but shows some drop in the corners. They also show an MTF at f8, and basically what it shows is that the corners are sharper, but there is some astigmatism, some separation between the sagittal and meridional planes. But it does show that definitely the corners are going to sharpen up as you stop the lens down. Now, I will do a deep dive into the optical performance at the end of the video if you want more of that, but here's how some of the other details shake out. The greatest optical weakness of this lens is it does have very heavy barrel distortion. It requires a +33 for correction, and as you can see with a manual correction, it leaves quite a mustache pattern behind. So you're going to want to use a profile correction. Fortunately, as you can see here, if we compare the JPEG showing the actual profile corrections, it straightens those lines up really nicely. So that's going to apply to JPEGs and videos. RAW files are going to have to use an actual software correction profile. Vignette is also heavy. It's at +76, so that's a lot. It's not the worst that I've seen in a wide-angle lens, but you're definitely going to need to correct that, and it tends to be quite concentrated in the very corners. And so again, it's not a particularly linear type vignette, and so you'll see it as just kind of some dark spots in the corner, and so you're probably going to want to correct that. Now, when it comes to the distortion, the Sony 16mm is F1.8G is just about as bad. And so it's not like the options out there are necessarily better. The Viltrox does have less distortion. However, it is a much larger lens. And so in these compact lenses, it seems like barrel distortion is kind of the price you pay for entry to getting such a compact lens. It does get worse, however. When I reviewed the Canon RF 16mm F2.8, it required a +70 to correct for the barrel distortion. It was nearly a fisheye lens before correction. And so fortunately, this isn't nearly as bad. I did see low amounts of fringing, and so I didn't see a lot of longitudinal style chromatic aberration before and after the plane of focus. And fortunately, I didn't see a lot of actual lateral style chromatic aberration either on my test chart or out in real world results, which is what matters the most, obviously. So that allows the corners to have a little bit more pop to it. As I looked using a 61 megapixel sensor, the A7R Mark V, and looking at 200% magnification, I found that the center looks fantastic from f2.8 on. The mid-frame looks great from f2.8 on. The corners are a little bit softer but not terrible. The biggest thing there is that they are a bit dark due to vignette. As you stop the lens down, you will see that corner performance gets increasingly better. By f8, I found that corner sharpness kind of peaks, but what I found in real world shots is that even at f5.6, for example, which tends to be my preferred aperture for shooting landscapes, I found that I just had like basically razor sharp images from corner to corner. I also saw good centering. It's very consistent all across the frame. It's able to achieve outstanding levels even on an ultra high resolution camera. You will see diffraction start to show up by f11, it gets worse at f16, and then worse still at f22, which is the minimum aperture. Contrast really stands out as being fantastic on this lens. Images have a lot of pop to them, and color saturation is very nice. I also had good results generally with flare resistance, and I found that in real-world situations shooting that I saw very, very little actual flare impact, and so that was great. Bokeh quality is generally okay. However, you will see some outlining, which means that things that fall into the transition zone are going to see a little bit jittery or nervous. They're going to stand out a bit more. Frankly, you don't buy lenses like this for the bokeh performance. Unfortunately, I didn't have the right kind of conditions for shooting the night sky, and so I can't really give you a coma performance. I did see Christopher Frost covered that, and he found that there was a bit of coma smear and a little bit of fringing that was showing up near the edges in that kind of situation. Overall here, outside of the barrel distortion, which stands out as being bad, though not necessarily worse than some of the competing lenses, I would say that the optical performance is really quite outstanding. So that's great if you're looking for a full frame lens with such a wide angle of view like this. And I will note that performance when you get out to the edges of the frame is way better than a lens like the Viltrox Air 20mm F2.8. This is definitely a stronger performing lens than that. So my conclusion on the LK Samyang 16mm F2.8 PFE is largely positive. I think that the main perceptual challenge for this lens is going to be the perceived value. And at $475 US, that isn't all that much less than a lens like the Viltrox AF 16mm f1.8. Obviously, the Viltrox lens is significantly bigger and heavier, but it also has more features, it has very good image quality, and it's going to be perceived as quite a significant value in comparison to this lens. I think that the sweet spot for this lens is for those that liked the form factor of a lens like the Sony 16mm f1.8 G lens, but don't want to pay the basically double price that it would take to purchase that lens. This lens, I think, slots in there very nicely, giving you an even more lightweight, compact option that has great image quality, as we've seen, outside of that barrel distortion and vignette. And it also is portable, has great autofocus. It has a lot going for it. I still don't quite understand how it fits with the 35mm f1.4 Prima lens, as that seemed to be the direction they were going, and now this seems to be a different direction. But I actually like this direction, as I think there's a lot of future in lenses that are very compact and also are high performing optically. A lot of people, including myself, are interested in lenses like that because they're so much easier to bring along. You can throw them into the bag. And frankly, you don't feel bad if you don't end up using it at the end of the day because you're carrying 207 grams of additional weight as opposed to carrying 600 to 800 grams of weight. And so I think that that's where the sweet spot for this lens is. Now, if you want a deeper dive into that optical performance, stay tuned with me right after this as we will jump into that and examine it together. You can also check out my full text review that's linked in the description down below. There are some buying links there as well, as if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. So let's jump into that image quality breakdown together. So let's start by taking a look at the difference between the normal full frame covering and then Super 35 or APS-C, because this is a lens I think that is certainly small enough that it could also be purchased by APS-C shooters, and it does certainly have some advantages there, and particularly if you have maybe an upgrade path in the future towards full frame. 24mm equivalent is always going to be a very useful focal length, while the resolution is lower, obviously, on my Sony a7R Mark V in APS-C mode. You can see that the APS-C image circle looks really crisp in the corners. Likewise, it looks really good here as well. We can just see that it's just a little bit softer in that last little percentage on a full frame camera. So the main optical flaw, as detailed before, is a strong amount of barrel distortion. This is a plus 33 to correct here, but you can see it's not a very clean correction. It creates some pincushion distortion in other places, so that's what we call a mustache pattern, where it's kind of a wavy rather than a linear type pattern. However, to put things in perspective, you can see while it's not quite as bad, the Sony 16mm F1.8 is nearly as bad. I used a plus 30 rather than a plus 33 in correcting, but both of them leave a mustache pattern afterward. They're both not great. If you want low distortion, the way to go is with the Viltrox, which has the most minimal amount of distortion of any of these 16mm primes. Now, while I'm releasing the review before the software profile is available here in Lightroom, you can see that if I grab a JPEG out of camera to compare with the raw on the left, you can see all the bulge from the distortion. But you can also see that the correction profile in camera is doing a great job, and all of those lines look nice and straight. Similarly, here's another interior shot, and so you can see in the places where there are some curves, like in these various straight lines, you can see that they all get straightened out in the JPEG, and you can see you are losing a little bit of the frame there, but I would say it's well worth it to get those straight lines. Now, fringing isn't a significant issue here. Now, you're going to, with a wide-angle lens like this, you're not going to have a lot of transition zone areas for fringing. You can see a tiny bit of green fringing as it transitions towards defocus here. No big deal there. When it comes to lateral style chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame, I'm seeing very minimal amounts both on my test chart, and it was similar when I looked out in real-world shots as well. So taking a look at resolution on a 61 megapixel A7R Mark V, here at 200% magnification, you can see the center of the frame is brilliantly sharp. Great contrast, great detail. If we go over here to the mid-frame looks awesome as well. It's only when we pan down to the corner, and in particular this last bit of the corner, that we see some drop off. However, we do see a good consistent centering with about equal performance in all of these corners everywhere that we look. So for some comparison, here's the Sony 16mm f1.8G, stopped down to f2.8. We can see in the center of the frame, I would argue that the Samyang is every bit as sharp and high contrast, maybe even a hair better, which is very, very impressive. Here in the mid-frame, they are very, very similar. The Sony's benefiting from the correction profile, whereas the Samyang is not. If we look into the corners are... they're really not all that different, and so I don't know that I can choose a winner. I do think that the Sony is maybe a little bit better right towards that very edge of the frame, and up here I'd say the Sony looks a little bit better, but these lenses are extremely close. If I compare to the Viltrox 16mm f1.8, we can see that center of the frame, Samyang is unquestionably better. It's an easy win there. In the mid-frame, the two lenses are close, but the Samyang probably shows just a little bit more detail. And into the corners, the Viltrox is the winner. It is the sharpest of the three lenses right off to the very edge of the frame, and that's true if we look at either one of these corners here. Now, I like to put that into real-world perspective, and so we can see here that even at f2.8, shooting up the wall here, you can see just how brilliantly sharp and great contrast is there in this LK Samyang lens. It looks really, really fantastic. Now, in the center of the frame, stopping the lens down doesn't really improve anything. You get a little bit more contrast, but you're not going to get any kind of really further gains. The mid-frame, that is roughly true as well. Up in the corners, however, you're going to see some improvement as you go along, most notably at f8. Here's f8, and you can see that it shows the best detail for the corners. A bit of that may be some field curvature, however, because real-world images here at f5.6, I mean, it looks fantastic. And that's true right off here towards the very edges of the frame. That is just brilliantly sharp and high contrast. Here's another here, and if we take a look here towards the edge of the frame, we can see that results are looking really, really nice. Lots of detail all throughout the frame. Here's another shot here. And again, if I look right down here into the corner, maybe in that last tiny bit, there's a little bit of drop off, but who's ever going to notice that? The actual amount of detail, contrast that is rendered here is fantastic. Now, the fraction will start to show up at f11 by f22, which is minimum aperture. You can see the image is significantly softer due to the effects of diffraction. So as noted, you can get a very high level of magnification, and you can see there is good contrast here. I did note a tiny bit, maybe of fringing here at very close, but while the field of the plane of focus is not very flat, as you can see, the amount of detail you can capture up close is actually really impressive. And of course, if you go into APS-C mode, as I have done here, you can increase that magnification level even higher, from 0.33 to 0.50 times. You're talking about something extremely useful by this point. One thing that stood out to me from this lens is generally just how great contrast is. And without having to do basically any editing to this image, you can see that contrast and thus color saturation is really fantastic. It allows images to really have a nice pop to them, which I think is great in a landscape style lens. And again, even if you're up close, you can see that it's rendering fine details really, really well. All of these little fine hairs, I'll call them, on the edge of the petals there, looks fantastic. Now the bokeh quality here, you can see it has more outlining than what I would like. This image actually I think looks pretty good. However, you can tell the bokeh is not super soft. Flare resistance, as noted previously, looks good, and here you can have a little bit closer look at that sun star. Now this is only at f11 here. The blades will become a little bit more pronounced at f16 and f22, though as we've seen, at the cost of the image at large being a little bit softer. And so as you can see, this is an appealing lens in a lot of ways. It is extremely sharp, and really the contrast stood out to me. The images have a lot of pop coming off of this particular lens, and that certainly is going to be appealing when you have such a compact, lightweight package. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.